The stagecoach door swung open, and Clara Whitlock stepped down into the dust of Red Hollow with a worn carpetbag and a heart full of lies. The man who'd promised her a new life was already gone, vanished like smoke, leaving her stranded in a town that didn't want her. Within minutes, she'd be standing in the middle of the street, humiliated, while strangers laughed and a cold-eyed rancher watched from the shadows. But Clara Whitlock didn't come this far to break. She came to survive. If you want to see how a woman with nothing built everything from dust and defiance, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Red Hollow depot, and Clara Whitlock felt her stomach tighten. She'd been traveling for 3 weeks, 2 trains, 1 ferry, and this final bone-jarring ride across open country that left her dress gray with dust and her hands cramped from gripping the seat rail. Now, as the driver climbed down and began unloading luggage, she pressed her palm against the window and stared out at the town that was supposed to be her future. Red Hollow wasn't much. A single dirt road split the town down the middle, flanked by wooden buildings that leaned like old men too tired to stand straight. There was a general store, a saloon with a crooked sign, a livery stable, and what looked like a boarding house with faded curtains in the windows. Beyond that, the land stretched flat and endless, broken only by distant hills that shimmered in the heat. Clara swallowed hard and reached for her bag. "End of the line, miss," the driver called, his voice rough and disinterested. She stepped down carefully, her boots sinking into the dust. The air was different here, dry and sharp, carrying the smell of horses and wood smoke. She looked around, scanning the few faces on the street, searching for the one she'd been promised, Thomas Fairley. The man who'd written her letters for 6 months, his words careful and kind, painting a picture of a life they'd build together. He'd sent money for her passage. He'd described the house he was building, the land he'd claimed, the future waiting for her. But Thomas Fairley was nowhere to be seen. Clara stood there, bag in hand, as the stagecoach driver tossed down the last of the cargo and climbed back onto his seat. "You got someone meeting you?" "Yes," she said, though her voice wavered. "I'm sure he'll be here any moment." The driver gave her a look that said he'd seen this before. Then he snapped the reins, and the stagecoach rolled away, leaving her alone in the middle of the street. She waited. Minutes passed. The sun beat down on her shoulders, and sweat began to gather at the base of her neck. A few townspeople glanced her way, curious, dismissive, but no one approached. Clara's hands tightened on the handle of her bag, and she felt the first cold thread of panic begin to weave through her chest. He wouldn't leave her. He wouldn't. "You lost?" The voice came from behind her, low and amused. Clara turned to find a man standing a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in clothes that had seen better days. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and mocking. "I'm waiting for someone," Clara said, lifting her chin. "Yeah?" The man glanced around, making a show of it. "Don't see nobody waiting for you." "He'll be here." "Uh-huh." The man stepped closer, and Clara caught the smell of whiskey on his breath. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "That's none of your concern." "Feisty." He grinned, but there was no warmth in it. "Let me guess. Mail-order bride. Come all the way out here for some fool who promised you the moon?" Clara's face burned, but she didn't answer. The man laughed. "Thought so. Well, I got bad news for you. Your man ain't coming." "You don't know that." "I know Thomas Fairley." The man's grin widened. "And I know he lit out of here 2 days ago with a widow from Cripple Creek. Left you high and dry, darlin'." The words hit her like a fist to the chest. Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her, felt the air go thin. "You're lying." "Am I?" The man shrugged. "Ask anyone in town. Thomas Fairley's gone, and he ain't coming back." Clara's vision blurred. She turned away, her breath coming fast and shallow, and for a moment she thought she might be sick right there in the street. She'd sold everything she owned to come here. She'd left behind the only life she'd ever known, traveled across half the country, all because Thomas Fairley had promised her a home. And now, he was gone. "Hey, don't take it so hard." The man's voice was closer now, almost friendly. "You got options. There's a saloon just down the road. Pretty thing like you could make decent money." Clara spun around, her hand tightening on her bag. "Get away from me." "Just trying to help." "I don't need your help." The man's expression darkened. You need somebody's help, sweetheart. You got no money, no place to go, and no man waiting for you. That makes you about as useful as a broke-down horse. Step back. Or what? He moved closer, his grin turning ugly. You gonna hit me with that little bag? Claire's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't move. She met his eyes, her jaw set, and for a moment they stood there in the dust, locked in a silence that felt like a drawn blade. Then a voice cut through the air, flat and cold. Leave her alone, Crane. The man, Crane, turned, his face twisting with irritation. Clara followed his gaze and saw another man standing a few yards away, leaning against the corner of the general store. He was older than Crane, maybe in his 40s, with dark hair streaked with gray and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His clothes were plain, work shirt, worn trousers, boots caked with dirt. But there was something about the way he stood that made Crane take a step back. This ain't your business, Hale. Didn't ask if it was. The man, Hale, straightened and walked toward them, his movement slow and deliberate. I said, leave her alone. Crane's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He shot Clara one last look, something between anger and amusement, then turned and walked away, his boots kicking up dust. Clara stood there, her chest heaving, and watched him go. When he was out of sight, she turned to the man who'd intervened. Thank you, she said, though the words felt thin. Hale didn't respond. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable, and Clara felt something shift in the air between them, something wary and uncertain. You got a place to stay? He asked finally. Clara hesitated. No, not yet. Fairley's gone. So I've been told. Hale studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp and assessing. Then he nodded toward the boarding house. Mrs. Calloway rents rooms. She'll take you in if you got money. Clara's fingers tightened on her bag. She had a little money, enough for a few nights, maybe a week if she was careful. After that, she didn't know. I'll manage, she said. Hale's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Good luck. He turned to leave, and Clara felt a sudden, irrational urge to call him back. But she didn't. She just stood there in the street, alone again, as the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down like a hand on her shoulders. Facts. Mrs. Calloway's boarding house smelled like boiled cabbage and old wood. The woman herself was narrow and sharp-eyed, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. $2 a week, she said, her voice clipped. Meals included, but don't expect nothing fancy. You pay in advance. Clara handed over the money, her hand shaking slightly, and Mrs. Calloway counted it twice before nodding. Room's upstairs, second door on the left. You cause trouble, you're out. I won't cause trouble, Mrs. Calloway sniffed. They all say that. The room was small and spare, a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a washstand with a cracked pitcher. The window overlooked the street, and Clara stood there for a long time, staring out at the town that was supposed to be her new life. She felt hollow, empty, like someone had reached inside her chest and pulled out everything that mattered. But she didn't cry. She'd learned a long time ago that crying didn't fix anything. That night, Clara lay in the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the town settling into darkness. Somewhere down the street, a piano played badly. A dog barked. Voices rose and fell, muffled and indistinct. She thought about Thomas Fairley, about the letters he'd written, the promises he'd made. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the cramped boarding house in Philadelphia, the factory job that paid barely enough to survive, the loneliness that had made her desperate enough to answer a stranger's ad in a newspaper. She thought about Crane's mocking grin, the way he'd looked at her like she was nothing. And she thought about the other man, Hale, the way he'd stepped in without asking, without expecting anything in return. The flatness in his voice when he told Crane to leave her alone. Clara turned onto her side and pulled the thin blanket up to her chin. She didn't know what she was going to do. She didn't know how she was going to survive in this place. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to break. It says. The next morning, Clara woke early and dressed carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt and pinning her hair back with the silver hairpin her mother had given her years ago. It was the only thing of value she had left, and she wore it like armor. Downstairs, Mrs. Calloway served breakfast in a cramped dining room. Hard bread, weak coffee, and eggs that tasted like they'd been cooked in lard. Clara ate in silence, ignoring the curious stares of the other boarders, and then stepped out into the street. She needed work. That much was clear. Her money wouldn't last, and she had no intention of ending up in Crane's saloon. The general store seemed like the most logical place to start. Clara pushed open the door, and a small bell chimed overhead. Inside, the air smelled like flour and tobacco, and shelves lined the walls stocked with canned goods, fabric, tools, and sundries. A man stood behind the counter, middle-aged, balding, with a tired face and ink-stained fingers. "Help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for work," Clara said. The man's eyebrows rose. "Work?" "Yes. I can keep books, manage inventory, clean, whatever you need." He shook his head slowly. "Don't need help." "Are you sure?" "I'm a hard worker. I won't ask for much." "I'm sure." His tone wasn't unkind, but it was final. "Try the saloon. They're always looking for girls." Clara's jaw tightened. "I'm not interested in that kind of work." The man shrugged. "Then I don't know what to tell you." She left the store, her chest tight with frustration, and walked down the street, trying every business she passed. The livery stable didn't need help. The blacksmith didn't hire women. The seamstress already had an apprentice. By midday, Clara was tired, hungry, and starting to feel the first sharp edges of desperation. She sat down on a bench outside the general store and stared at the dust swirling in the street. Around her, the town moved on, people going about their business, oblivious to the fact that her entire world had just collapsed. "Still here?" Clara looked up and found Hale standing a few feet away, a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. "Where else would I be?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Hale set the sack down and studied her. "You find work?" "No." "Mrs. Calloway treating you all right?" "Well enough." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting past her toward the hills beyond the town. For a moment, Clara thought he was going to walk away. But then he spoke again, his voice low and measured. "I got a place outside town, small ranch. I could use someone to help around the house." Clara blinked. "You're offering me a job?" "Offering you a chance?" Hale corrected. "It's hard work, long days, pays not much, but you'd have a place to sleep and food to eat." "Why?" Clara asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "Why would you help me?" Hale's expression didn't change. "Because you need it, and because I don't like seeing people get trampled." Clara stared at him, trying to read the truth in his face. She didn't know this man, didn't know if she could trust him, but she also didn't have many options. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Cooking, cleaning, mending. There's a garden that needs tending, but it's mostly dead. If you can bring it back, that'd be useful." "I don't know much about gardening." "Then you'll learn." Clara hesitated, her mind racing. This could be a trap. It could be worse than the saloon, but it could also be the only chance she had. "All right," she said finally. "I'll do it." Hale picked up his sack and nodded toward the edge of town. "Get your things. We leave in an hour." Clara packed quickly, shoving her few belongings into her carpet bag and paying Mrs. Calloway for the night she wouldn't be staying. The woman took the money without comment, and Clara walked out into the street, her heart pounding. Hale was waiting near the livery stable with a horse and a small wagon. He didn't say much as Clara climbed into the back, just clicked his tongue and set the horse moving. They rode in silence, the town falling away behind them as the land opened up, flat and endless, broken only by scrub brush and the occasional cluster of rocks. The sun was high and brutal, and Clara pulled her shawl over her head to keep from burning. After about an hour, Hale turned the wagon off the main road and onto a narrow track that cut through the scrub. In the distance, Clara could see a small house, wooden, weathered, with a sagging porch and a chimney that leaned slightly to one side. Beyond it, a low barn and a few scattered outbuildings. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had. Hale pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, offering Clara a hand. She took it, her legs stiff from the ride, and looked around. The land was harsh, dry, the kind of place that didn't forgive mistakes. "House is there?" Hale said, nodding toward the building. "Your room's on the left. I'll be in the barn most days. You need something, you ask." Clara nodded, gripping her bag. "What about the garden?" Hale turned and pointed to a patch of ground behind the house. Clara followed his gaze and felt her stomach sink. The garden was a graveyard. Rows of withered plants, brown and brittle, choked by weeds and baked hard by the sun. The soil looked like cracked leather, and there wasn't a single green thing in sight. "That's what you're working with," Hale said. "Good luck." He walked toward the barn, leaving Clara standing alone in the yard. She stared at the dead garden, at the broken land around her, and felt something hard and cold settle in her chest. This wasn't a new life. This was survival, raw and unforgiving. But Clara Whitlock had come too far to give up now. She set down her bag, rolled up her sleeves, and walked toward the garden. Thwalk. The first week was brutal. Clara woke before dawn and worked until her hands bled. She hauled water from the well, bucket by bucket, soaking the cracked soil until it was soft enough to turn. She pulled weeds until her back screamed and her knees were raw. She dug through the dirt, searching for anything that might still be alive, and found almost nothing. Hale didn't help. He worked the ranch, mending fences, tending the few cattle he had, fixing what was broken. He was up before her and still working long after she'd gone to bed. They rarely spoke. When they did, it was brief and practical. "Need more water buckets. There's a spring a mile north, easier than the well. How do I fix this soil? Compost, manure, time." Clara learned quickly that Hale wasn't a man who wasted words. He didn't ask about her past, didn't pry into why she'd come to Red Hollow, and she didn't ask about his. But she watched him. She saw the way he moved, careful, deliberate, like someone who'd learned not to trust the ground beneath his feet. She saw the scars on his hands, the lines around his eyes that spoke of too many hard years. She saw the way he kept his distance, not out of cruelty, but out of something deeper, something broken. At night, Clara fell into bed exhausted, her muscles aching, her mind too tired to think. But she didn't complain. She didn't ask for sympathy. She just kept working. By the end of the second week, the garden was still mostly dead, but Clara had cleared the worst of the weeds and turned the soil in one small section. She planted a few seeds she'd found in the barn, beans, squash, maybe some kind of herb, and watered them carefully, hoping for a miracle. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky orange, Hale walked over to the garden and stood there, looking at the patch of turned soil. "Making progress," he said. Clara wiped the sweat from her forehead and nodded. "It's slow. Most things worth doing are." She glanced at him, surprised by the almost compliment, but Hale was already walking away. "Vopa seke." The third week brought rain. It started as a drizzle, then turned into a downpour that lasted 2 days. Clara stood on the porch and watched the water soak into the ground, watched the garden drink it in like a man dying of thirst. When the rain stopped, she went back to work, and a few days later she saw it, a tiny green shoot pushing up through the dark soil. Clara knelt down, her breath catching, and touched the fragile stem with the tip of her finger. It was real, alive. She sat back on her heels and felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for weeks. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Clara smiled. One afternoon, Hale came back from town with supplies and a visitor. The man climbed down from the wagon slowly, favoring one leg, and Clara recognized him immediately. Victor Crane. He looked different than he had that first day. Thinner, older. There was a bruise on his jaw and a cut above his eye that hadn't healed right. Clara's hand stilled on the laundry she'd been hanging, and she felt her entire body go tense. Hale walked past her without a word and headed into the barn. Crane stood in the yard, looking around like he wasn't sure where to go. Clara stepped off the porch, her jaw set. "What are you doing here?" Crane turned, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or shame. "Hale said I could stay a few days. Got into some trouble in town." "That's not my problem." "Didn't say it was." Crane shifted his weight, wincing. "Look, I ain't here to bother you. I just need a place to lay low." Clara crossed her arms. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Crane's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I remember." "Good. Then stay out of my way." She turned and walked back to the laundry line, her hands shaking with anger. Behind her, Crane stood silent for a moment. Then he limped toward the barn. That night, Clara lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She didn't know why Hale had brought Crane here, didn't know what kind of trouble he was in, and didn't care. But she knew one thing. She wasn't the same woman who'd stepped off that stagecoach 3 weeks ago. She wasn't the same woman who'd been humiliated in the street, who'd felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. She'd survived. She'd worked. She'd brought life back to dead ground. And she wasn't going to let Victor Crane, or anyone else, take that away from her. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. And in the garden, the tiny green shoots pushed higher, reaching for the sky. Crane stayed in the barn. Clara made sure of that. She didn't ask Hale why he'd brought the man here, and Hale didn't offer an explanation. That was how things worked between them. Silence where most people would need words. But the silence felt different now, heavier, like something unspoken was pressing down on all of them. Clara kept to her routine. Up before dawn, water hauled from the spring, soil turned and tended. The green shoots in the garden were growing, slow, stubborn, but real. She checked them every morning, her fingers brushing the delicate leaves, and felt something close to pride. Crane kept his distance for the first 2 days. He slept in the barn, helped Hale with the cattle when he could move without wincing, and avoided the house entirely. Clara saw him sometimes, limping across the yard or sitting on an overturned crate near the barn door, rolling cigarettes with shaking hands. She didn't speak to him, didn't acknowledge him, but she watched. On the third morning, Clara was hauling a bucket of water to the garden when Crane stepped out of the barn and into her path. "Need help with that?" he asked. Clara stopped, her grip tightening on the bucket handle. "No. It's heavy. I'm fine." Crane didn't move. He stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face bruised and hollow. Up close, he looked worse than she'd realized. The cut above his eye was infected, red and swollen, and there was a grayness to his skin that spoke of fever or exhaustion, or both. "Look," he said, his voice rough. "I know you don't want me here, I get it, but I ain't trying to make trouble. Then stay out of my way." "I'm trying to." Clara stepped around him and kept walking. Behind her, Crane let out a slow breath but didn't follow. That night, Hale came into the kitchen while Clara was cleaning up after supper. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "Crane's leaving in a few days," he said. Clara wiped down the counter and didn't look up. "Good. He's not a bad man. Could have fooled me." Hale turned, his expression unreadable. "He's got a mouth on him, and he's made his share of mistakes. But he's not what you think." "I don't care what he is," Clara said flatly. "He humiliated me in front of half the town, called me useless, told me I should work in a saloon." "I know." "Then why is he here?" Hale took a sip of coffee, his gaze steady. "Because he got beaten half to death 3 nights ago. And because I don't leave men to die in the street no matter what they've done." Clara's hand stilled on the dish towel. "What happened?" "Card game went wrong. Couple of men didn't like losing. They took it out on him." "That's not my problem." "No," Hale agreed. "It's not." He set down his cup and walked out, leaving Clara standing alone in the kitchen. She stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. The next morning, Clara was working in the garden when she heard a crash from the barn. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and listened. Another crash, followed by a low curse. She hesitated, then set down her trowel and walked toward the barn. Inside, Crane was on his knees trying to pick up a stack of wooden crates that had toppled over. His hands were shaking badly, and when he tried to lift one of the crates, he dropped it again with a grunt of pain. "Stop," Clara said from the doorway. Crane looked up, his face flushed. "I got it." "You clearly don't." "I said I got it." Clara walked over and knelt down beside him, grabbing one end of the crate. "Take the other side." Crane stared at her for a moment, something uncertain flickering in his eyes. Then he gripped the crate, and together they lifted it back into place. They worked in silence, restacking the crates one by one. When they finished, Crane sat back on his heels, breathing hard. "Thanks," he said quietly. Clara stood and brushed the dust off her skirt. "You should see a doctor about that cut." "Can't afford a doctor." "Then clean it properly before it kills you." She turned to leave, but Crane's voice stopped her. "I'm sorry." Clara looked back at him. "What?" "For what I said, that day in town. Crane's jaw tightened, and he wouldn't meet her eyes. I was drunk, and I was being an ass, but that don't excuse it. Clara studied him, her expression hard. No, it doesn't. I know. She turned and walked out of the barn without another word, but something had shifted. That evening, Clara boiled water and soaked a clean cloth, then walked out to the barn. Crane was sitting on his cot, staring at the wall. Sit still, Clara said. He looked up, startled. What? That cut's infected. If you don't clean it, you'll be dead in a week. Crane frowned but didn't argue. He sat there, tense and silent, as Clara dabbed at the wound with the cloth. He flinched when she pressed too hard, but he didn't pull away. You always this stubborn? Clara asked. Could ask you the same thing. I'm not stubborn, I'm practical. Crane let out a short, humorless laugh. Right. Clara finished cleaning the wound and stepped back. Change the bandage every day, and stop drinking if you want it to heal. Yes, ma'am. She walked back to the house, her hands still damp, and felt the weight of Hale's gaze on her from the porch. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. Hale nodded slowly. You're tougher than you look. Clara didn't answer. She just went inside and closed the door. Over the next few days, the rhythm of the ranch settled into something almost normal. Clara worked the garden, coaxing life from the stubborn soil. Hale fixed what needed fixing, his hands always busy, his expression always guarded. And Crane, slowly, carefully, began to help. He hauled firewood. He mended a broken fence post. He even tried to help Clara with the garden, though he had no idea what he was doing. Not like that, Clara said, watching him dig a hole twice as deep as it needed to be. You're planting beans, not burying a body. Crane looked up, his face smudged with dirt. How the hell am I supposed to know the difference? Use your brain. Didn't know you were so charming. Clara shot him a look, but there was no real heat in it. Just do it right. Crane grumbled but followed her instructions. And when the beans were planted, he sat back and wiped his forehead, his expression grudgingly satisfied. There, he said. Happy now? We'll see if they grow. They'll grow. Clara glanced at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. How do you know? Crane shrugged. Because you don't let things die. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment Clara didn't know what to say. One evening, Hale came back from town with a newspaper tucked under his arm. He tossed it onto the kitchen table, and Clara saw the headline splashed across the front page. Land fraud investigation continues. Several arrests expected. She picked up the paper and skimmed the article. It was vague. Talk of falsified deeds, corrupt officials, land seized from homesteaders who couldn't prove ownership. The kind of thing that happened all the time out here, where the law was thin and money talked louder than justice. Why are you showing me this? Clara asked. Hale poured himself a cup of coffee. Because Crane's name is in there. Clara's eyes snapped back to the page, scanning until she found it. Victor Crane, listed among those under investigation. He was part of it? She asked. Not exactly. Hale sat down across from her. He worked for the men running the scheme. Didn't know what they were doing at first, but by the time he figured it out, he was in too deep. So he's a criminal. He's a fool, Hale corrected. There's a difference. Clara set down the paper, her mind racing. Is that why he got beaten? Someone thought he'd talk? Probably. And you brought him here anyway. Hale met her gaze, his expression calm. I did. Clara shook her head, frustration bubbling up in her chest. You don't owe him anything. No, Hale agreed. But I know what it's like to make mistakes and not get a second chance. There was something in his voice, something raw and unguarded, that made Clara stop. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the weight he carried in the lines of his face, the stillness of his hands. What happened to you? She asked quietly. Hale's jaw tightened. He stood, picking up his cup, and walked to the door. Doesn't matter. And then he was gone. The garden was thriving now. The beans had sprouted thick and green, climbing the stakes Clara had driven into the ground. The squash plants were spreading, their broad leaves soaking up the sun. Even the herbs, rosemary, thyme, something she thought might be sage, were growing in neat rows along the edge of the plot. Clara spent hours out there, her hands in the soil, her mind quiet. It was the only place she felt like herself anymore. The only place where the past didn't press down on her shoulders. One afternoon, she was thinning the bean plants when Crane walked over and crouched down beside her. "Looks good," he said. "It's getting there." Crane picked up a clod of dirt and crumbled it between his fingers. "You ever think about what you're going to do after this?" Clara glanced at him. "After what?" "After the garden's done. After you've proved you can survive out here." He tossed the dirt aside. "What then?" "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "You should." "Why?" Crane was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Because surviving ain't the same as living, and if you're not careful, you wake up one day and realize you forgot the difference." Clara studied him, surprised by the bitterness in his voice. "Is that what happened to you?" Crane let out a short laugh. "Yeah, something like that." He stood and walked away, leaving Clara alone in the garden. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky turned black, and the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and bending the trees. Clara stood on the porch and watched the clouds gather, her arms wrapped around herself. Hale came out and stood beside her, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Gonna be a bad one," he said. "Should I cover the garden?" "Won't help. Just hope the roots hold." They stood there in silence as the first drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it was a downpour, the kind that turned the ground to mud and drowned out every other sound. Clara stayed on the porch, watching the water pour off the roof in sheets. Hale stood beside her, solid and silent, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara felt something other than fear. She felt steady. The storm lasted through the night. By morning, the yard was a swamp, and the garden was battered but intact. Clara walked through the rows, checking each plant, and found only a few casualties. She knelt down and replanted what had been uprooted, her hands steady, her mind focused. When she finished, she stood and wiped her hands on her apron. Across the yard, she saw Crane standing near the barn, watching her. He raised a hand in a half wave, and Clara, after a moment, nodded back. The days blurred together after that. Work, meals, sleep. Hale remained distant but fair, his presence a constant anchor. Crane stayed longer than the few days Hale had promised, and Clara stopped asking when he was leaving. One evening, the three of them sat on the porch after supper, passing around a jar of whiskey Hale had pulled from somewhere in the barn. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and purple, and the air was finally cool. "Never thought I'd end up here," Crane said, staring out at the horizon. "Where'd you think you'd end up?" Clara asked. Crane shrugged. "Somewhere better, or dead. One of the two." Hale took a sip from the jar. "Still time for both." Crane laughed, a genuine sound, and Clara found herself smiling despite everything. "What about you?" Crane asked, looking at Clara. "Where'd you think you'd be?" Clara thought about it, her hands wrapped around the jar. "Somewhere safe," she said finally. "Somewhere I didn't have to fight just to exist." "You find it?" Clara looked out at the garden, at the land she'd clawed back to life, and felt something settle in her chest. "Maybe," she said. A week later, Crane was gone. Clara woke one morning to find his cot empty, his few belongings packed and taken. Hale was in the kitchen, drinking coffee like it was any other day. "He left?" Clara asked. "Yeah." "Where'd he go?" "Didn't say." Clara poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down. She should have felt relieved. Crane had been a reminder of everything she wanted to forget, the humiliation, the anger, the helplessness. But instead, she felt something else, something like regret. "He say anything before he left?" she asked. Hale looked at her over the rim of his cup. "He said to tell you thank you." Clara stared down at her coffee, her throat tight. "For what?" "For not letting him die." The words settled over her, heavy and true, and Clara didn't know what to say. So she said nothing. The weeks that followed were quiet. Clara threw herself into the garden, into the work that never seemed to end. The plants grew taller, stronger, and she began to see the first signs of a harvest. Small green beans, the beginnings of squash, clusters of tiny tomatoes. Hale watched her sometimes, from a distance, and Clara could feel the weight of his gaze. But he never said anything. One evening, as she was watering the last row of plants, Hale walked over and stood beside her. "You did good here," he said. Clara looked around at the garden, at the life she'd pulled from the dirt, and felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months: pride. "Thanks," she said quietly. Hale nodded. "You planning to stay?" Clara looked at him, surprised. "You want me to?" "I'm asking if you want to." Clara thought about it. About the weeks she'd spent here, the work she'd done, the quiet rhythm of life on the ranch. It wasn't easy. It wasn't what she'd imagined when she left Philadelphia. But it was hers. "Yeah," she said, "I want to stay." Hale's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "All right then." He turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Clara standing in the garden as the sun dipped below the horizon. And for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, Clara felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next morning, Clara was in the kitchen when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door, expecting to see Hale returning from town. Instead, she saw a stranger. The man was tall and thin, dressed in a dusty black suit with a narrow face and sharp eyes. He climbed down from his horse slowly, his gaze sweeping over the ranch. Hale came out of the barn, his expression immediately wary. "Help you?" he asked. The man turned and offered a thin smile. "Jonas Hale?" "Who's asking?" "Name's Edward Brill. I'm a land assessor for the territory." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "I'm here about your property." Clara felt her stomach tighten. She stepped onto the porch, her hands gripping the railing. Hale didn't move. "What about it?" Brill unfolded the document and glanced at it. "Says here you filed a homestead claim 5 years ago. That right?" "That's right." "And you've been working the land ever since?" "Every damn day." Brill nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the yard, the barn, the garden. "Well, Mr. Hale, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's been some question about the validity of your claim." "What kind of question?" "The kind that says the original deed was filed improperly. Signatures don't match. Dates are off." Brill folded the document and tucked it back into his coat. "I'm afraid the land may not actually be yours." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Hale's jaw tightened, and Clara saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "That's bullshit," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Hale." Brill stepped back toward his horse. "You'll be notified if any action is taken. In the meantime, I'd recommend you get yourself a lawyer." He climbed onto his horse and rode away, leaving Hale standing in the yard, his face like stone. Clara walked down from the porch and stood beside him, her heart pounding. "What does this mean?" she asked. Hale didn't answer. He just stared after Brill, his eyes dark and unreadable. And Clara knew, with a cold certainty that settled in her bones, that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Hale didn't speak for the rest of the day. He went into the barn and didn't come out, and Clara knew better than to follow. She went back to the garden, her hands working the soil even though her mind was somewhere else entirely. A land assessor. Questions about the deed, the threat hanging over everything they'd built here. Clara had seen this before, back in Philadelphia. Men in suits showing up with papers, telling families their homes didn't belong to them anymore. Legal words that didn't mean justice, just power. She'd watched neighbors get evicted, their belongings thrown into the street, and there was never anything anyone could do about it. But this was different. This was Hale's land. He'd worked it for 5 years, bled for it, survived on it. And now some stranger in a black suit was telling him it might all be taken away. Clara pulled a weed so hard the roots tore through the soil, dirt spraying across her apron. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, and stared at the neat rows of beans and squash. She'd just started to believe this place could be hers too, that she could build something here that no one could take away. Stupid, she thought bitterly. Nothing's ever really yours. That evening, Clara made supper and set a plate outside the barn door. Hale didn't come out to get it. When she checked an hour later, the food was cold and untouched. She knocked on the barn door. "Hale?" No answer. "I know you're in there." Still nothing. Clara pressed her forehead against the rough wood and closed her eyes. "You can't just hide in there forever." A long silence. Then Hale's voice, muffled and flat. "Go inside, Clara. Not until you talk to me." "There's nothing to talk about." "The hell there isn't." Claire's voice rose, anger breaking through. "Someone just showed up and told you they're taking your land. You think I'm going to pretend that's not happening?" The barn door swung open and Hale stood there, his face shadowed. What do you want me to say? That I'm going to fight it? That I'm going to hire some lawyer who'll take what little money I got left and tell me there's nothing he can do? I want you to stop acting like it's already over. Hale's jaw tightened. You don't know how these things work. I know exactly how they work, Clara shot back. I've seen it. Men like Brill don't show up because there's a mistake in the paperwork. They show up because someone wants your land and they've got enough money to make it happen. Then what's the point? The point is you don't just give up. Hale stared at her, something raw and exhausted in his eyes. I've been fighting my whole life, Clara, and I'm tired. The words hung between them, heavy and true. Clara felt her anger drain away, replaced by something quieter, sadder. I know, she said softly, but if you give up now, they win. And I don't think you're the kind of man who lets people win. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the plate of cold food and went back inside the barn, closing the door behind him. Clara stood there in the dark, listening to the wind move through the scrub brush, and felt the weight of what was coming settle over her like a stone. The next morning, Hale was gone before Clara woke up. His horse was missing from the stable, and when she checked the house, there was a note on the kitchen table written in rough, blocky letters. Gone to town. Back tonight. Clara folded the note and set it aside, her chest tight. She knew where he was going, to find out more about Brill, about the claim, about who was behind this. She spent the day working, but her mind kept drifting. Every time she heard hoofbeats, she looked up, half expecting to see Hale riding back. But the hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, and the yard stayed empty. It was late afternoon when she finally heard the sound of a wagon coming up the road. Clara shielded her eyes and squinted into the distance, expecting Hale. Instead, she saw two horses pulling a small covered wagon, and perched on the seat was a woman Clara didn't recognize. The woman was older, maybe 50, with gray-streaked hair tied back under a faded bonnet. Her face was weathered, her hands strong and calloused. She pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down slowly, favoring one leg. Afternoon, she called. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. Can I help you? The woman looked her up and down, her eyes sharp and assessing. You must be Clara. I'm Ruth Calloway. Clara blinked. Mrs. Calloway? From the boarding house? That's right. Ruth gestured toward the garden. Heard you've been working wonders out here. Wanted to see for myself. Clara glanced back at the garden, then at Ruth. How did you hear about that? Small town. People talk. Ruth walked past her toward the rows of plants, moving with a stiff but determined gait. She knelt down and ran her fingers over the bean leaves, her expression thoughtful. Hale tell you about the land trouble? He didn't have to. I was here when Brill showed up. Ruth nodded slowly. Figured as much. That's why I came. I don't understand. Ruth straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. Edward Brill works for a man named Garrett Voss. Voss owns half the territory, or thinks he does. He's been buying up land claims for years, sometimes legal, mostly not. If Brill's sniffing around here, it means Voss wants this property. Clara felt her stomach tighten. Why? Water, probably. There's a spring on the north edge of Hale's land. Good, clean water. Voss has been trying to control the water rights in this area for years. If he gets Hale's land, he gets the spring. Can't Hale fight it? Ruth's expression turned grim. He can try. But Voss has lawyers, judges, sheriffs, half of them on his payroll. And Hale's got nothing but 5 years of work and a deed that Brill's already calling into question. Clara's hands curled into fists. That's not fair. No, Ruth agreed. But fair doesn't mean much out here. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind moving through the garden, rustling the leaves. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked. Ruth looked at her, and something softened in her eyes. Because I've known Jonas Hale for a long time. He's a good man, a stubborn one, but good. And he's been alone too long. She paused. But now he's not. And I think that matters. Clara didn't know what to say. Ruth patted her shoulder, a gesture that was almost motherly, and walked back to her wagon. One more thing, Ruth said, climbing onto the seat. Victor Crane came by my place yesterday. Clara's head snapped up. Crane? What did he want? Said he had information about Voss, about the land fraud scheme. Ruth gathered the reins. I told him to take it to the sheriff, but he said the sheriff's in Voss's pocket, so he's looking for someone who'll listen. Where is he now? Don't know. He looked bad, Clara. Real bad. Like he'd been on the run for days. Ruth's expression darkened. If Voss's men are after him, he won't last long. She snapped the reins and the wagon began to roll. Clara stood in the yard, her mind racing, as Ruth disappeared down the road. Hale came back just after dark, riding hard. He dismounted and led the horse into the barn without a word. Clara met him at the door, her arms crossed. Where were you? Town. Hale pulled the saddle off and slung it over a rail. Talked to a lawyer. He said the same thing you did. Someone wants the land, and they're using the deed to take it. Ruth Calloway was here. Hale stopped, his hand stilling on the saddle. Ruth? What'd she want? To warn us. She said a man named Garrett Voss is behind this, that he wants the spring. Hale's jaw tightened. Voss? You know him? Everyone knows him. Hale turned, his expression dark. He's been buying up land for years. Runs it like his own little kingdom. If he wants this place, he won't stop until he gets it. Then we fight him. Hale let out a bitter laugh. With what? I don't have the money for a legal battle, and even if I did, Voss owns the judge. Ruth said Crane has information about the fraud scheme. Hale went still. Crane? She said he came by her place, that he's looking for someone who will listen. Hale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he shook his head. Crane's a dead man if Voss finds him. Then we need to find him first. Clara. I'm not sitting here waiting for them to take everything, Clara said, her voice hard. If Crane has information that can help, we need to get it. Hale stared at her, something shifting in his expression. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, we'll look for him, but if this goes bad, it won't. Hale's mouth twitched, almost a smile. You don't know that. No, Clara agreed, but I'm done being afraid. They rode out at first light, heading toward town. Hale had a few places in mind, spots where a man on the run might hide. The old mill outside Red Hollow, the burned-out homestead near the creek, the caves in the hills to the east. They checked the mill first. It was empty, the door hanging off its hinges, the interior thick with dust. No sign that anyone had been there in months. The homestead was the same, just charred timbers and broken glass, the wind whistling through the empty frame. By midday, they were riding toward the hills, and Clara could feel the tension coiled tight in Hale's shoulders. He scanned the horizon constantly, his hand never far from the rifle strapped to his saddle. You think Voss's men are out here? Clara asked. If they're looking for Crane, yeah. What'll they do if they find him? Hale didn't answer, but the look on his face told her everything she needed to know. They found the caves just as the sun was starting to dip. Hale dismounted and tied his horse to a scrub tree, then pulled the rifle from its holster. Stay here, he said. Not a chance. Hale looked like he wanted to argue, but he just sighed and handed her a knife from his belt. Stay close, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understand? Clara took the knife, her hand shaking slightly. Understood. They moved into the cave mouth, the shadows swallowing them. It was cooler inside, the air damp and still. Hale moved ahead, his steps careful, the rifle raised. Crane, he called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. No answer. They moved deeper, the light from the entrance fading behind them. Clara's eyes adjusted slowly, picking out the rough shapes of rocks and crevices. And then she saw it. A figure slumped against the far wall, barely visible in the dim light. Hale, she whispered. He turned, following her gaze, and swore under his breath. They moved closer, and Clara's stomach twisted. It was Crane. He was alive, but barely. His face was swollen and bruised, his shirt torn and soaked with blood. One arm hung at an odd angle, and when he tried to lift his head, he let out a low groan of pain. Jesus, Hale muttered, kneeling beside him. What the hell happened? Crane's eyes flickered open, unfocused. Hale? Yeah, it's me. Who did this? Voss's men. Crane coughed, and blood flecked his lips. They found me. Beat the hell out of me. Left me for dead. Why didn't they finish it? Crane let out a weak, bitter laugh. Think they figured the desert would do it for them. Clara knelt on Crane's other side, her hands hovering over him, unsure where to start. His injuries were bad, worse than anything she'd dealt with before. We need to get him back to the ranch, she said. He won't make it. Hale said flatly. Not like this. Then we'll have to try. Clara looked at Crane, at the blood soaking through his shirt, and felt something harden in her chest. We didn't come all this way to leave him here. Hale stared at her for a moment. Then he nodded. All right, help me get him up. They lifted Crane between them, and he screamed, a raw, agonized sound that echoed through the cave. Clara's hands were slick with his blood, and her arms shook with the effort of holding him upright. I got you, she said, her voice tight. Just hold on. Crane's head lolled against her shoulder, his breathing shallow and ragged. Why are you helping me? Clara didn't answer. She just tightened her grip and helped Hale carry him toward the light. The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare. They'd rigged a makeshift sling using blankets and rope, dragging Crane behind Hale's horse. Every jolt made him cry out, and Clara rode beside him, one hand on his shoulder, trying to keep him steady. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was setting, and Crane had stopped making noise. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as they pulled him into the house and laid him on the kitchen table. Is he? She started. He's breathing, Hale said, but not for long if we don't do something. Clara rolled up her sleeves and started boiling water, her hands moving on instinct. She'd stitched up cuts before, set broken bones, tended fevers. But this was different. This was someone dying right in front of her, and she didn't know if she could stop it. Hale cut away Crane's shirt, revealing a mess of bruises and lacerations. His ribs were broken. Clara could see the unnatural shape of his chest, and his arm. We need to set that, Hale said, nodding toward the twisted limb. I don't know how. Neither do I. But if we don't, he'll lose it. Clara looked at Crane's pale, unconscious face and felt a cold certainty settle over her. She'd come too far to let him die. Not like this. All right, she said. Tell me what to do. They worked through the night. Hale held Crane down while Clara cleaned the wounds, her hands shaking as she stitched the worst of the cuts. When it came time to set the arm, Hale pulled while Clara braced Crane's shoulder, and the sound of the bone snapping back into place made her stomach turn. Crane screamed, even unconscious, and then went limp. For a moment, Clara thought he was gone. But then his chest rose, shallow and uneven, and she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. He's still alive, Hale said, his voice rough. Clara nodded, too exhausted to speak. She cleaned the blood from her hands and sank into a chair, her entire body trembling. Hale poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed her one. Clara took it and drank, the burn cutting through the fog in her mind. Why'd you do it? Hale asked after a long silence. Do what? Insist we bring him back. He's the man who humiliated you, the man who told you you were worthless. Clara stared at the glass in her hands. I know. So why? She thought about it, about the moment in the cave when she'd looked at Crane's broken body and made the choice. Not because she'd forgiven him, not because she liked him, but because leaving him to die would have made her into something she didn't want to be. Because, she said finally, I'm not him. Hale looked at her for a long moment, something like respect in his eyes. Then he raised his glass. To not being the worst version of ourselves. Clara clinked her glass against his and drank. Crane didn't wake for 3 days. Clara sat with him, changing his bandages, forcing water between his cracked lips, checking his breathing every hour. She barely slept, and when she did, it was in the chair beside the table, her head on her arms. Hale tried to get her to rest, but she refused. If he dies because I wasn't paying attention, he won't, Hale said. You've done everything you can. It might not be enough. It's more than most people would have done. On the 4th day, Crane's eyes opened. Clara was changing the bandage on his arm when she saw it. The flicker of consciousness, the slow blink. She froze, her hands stilling. Crane? His eyes focused on her, hazy and confused. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Clara grabbed the water cup and held it to his mouth. Don't talk, just drink. He drank, coughing weakly, and then his head fell back against the pillow. You... His voice was barely a whisper. You saved me. Clara set down the cup, her throat tight. Don't make it a thing. Why? Because I don't want your gratitude. I just want you to live long enough to tell us what you know about Voss. Crane let out a weak, rattling laugh. Always practical. Someone has to be. Over the next few days, Crane grew stronger. He still couldn't walk, and his arm was useless, but he could sit up and talk, and that was enough. Hale pulled a chair up to the table one evening, his expression grim. "Tell me about Voss." Crane's face darkened. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. How the scheme works, who's involved, how we stop it." Crane was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he started talking. He told them about the land fraud operation, how Voss's men would find homesteaders with valuable property and dig through old records, looking for any flaw in the deeds, forged signatures, missing dates, clerical errors, anything they could use to challenge the claim. Then they'd send in someone like Brill to make it official, scare the homesteader into selling cheap, or force them off the land entirely. "And if they don't go quietly?" Hale asked. Crane's jaw tightened. "Then Voss sends his men to convince them." "Like he did to you." "Yeah, like he did to me." "Why'd he turn on you?" Crane looked away, shame flickering across his face. "Because I tried to get out. I figured out what was happening, and I didn't want any part of it anymore. But Voss doesn't let people just walk away. So he tried to kill you. And he'll keep trying until I'm dead." Hale leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. "Unless we stop him first." Crane laughed bitterly. "You can't stop Garrett Voss. He owns this territory." "Maybe," Hale said, "but he doesn't own me." Clara looked at him, saw the steel in his eyes, and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about standing up to the kind of men who took what they wanted and crushed anyone who got in their way. "What do we need?" she asked. Hale turned to her. "Proof. Something that ties Voss to the fraud. Something even his bought judges can't ignore." Crane shook his head. "You'll never get it. Voss keeps everything locked up tight. Ledgers, deeds, payoff records. It's all in his office in Red Hollow, and it's guarded day and night." "Then we'll have to find another way," Clara said. Hale and Crane both looked at her. "Like what?" Crane asked. Clara thought for a moment, her mind working through the problem. "Ruth said you had information. What kind?" Crane hesitated. "Names, dates, transactions. I kept copies of some of the paperwork before I left. Figured it might keep me alive if things went bad." "Where are they?" "Hidden, in town." Hale leaned forward. "Can you get to them?" "Not in this condition." Crane gestured to his broken body. "But you could." "Where?" Crane told them. A loose floorboard in the back room of the saloon, under the bar. He'd stashed the papers there weeks ago, before everything went to hell. "If those documents are real," Hale said slowly, "we might actually have a shot." "Might," Crane agreed, "but it's a long shot." Clara stood, her jaw set. "Then we'd better not miss." The next morning, Clara and Hale rode into town. The streets were quiet, the early light casting long shadows across the dirt. They tied their horses outside the saloon and stepped inside. The place was empty except for the bartender, a grizzled man named Sullivan, who looked like he'd been pouring drinks since before Clara was born. "Little early for a drink," Sullivan said, not looking up from the glass he was cleaning. "Not here for a drink," Hale said. "Need to check something in the back." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "That's so." Hale pulled a few coins from his pocket and set them on the bar. "Won't take long." Sullivan pocketed the coins and jerked his head toward the back room. "Make it quick." They moved into the cramped storage area, and Hale knelt down, running his hands over the floorboards. Claire kept watch at the door, her heart pounding. "Got it," Hale said, prying up a loose board. He reached into the gap and pulled out a folded stack of papers, yellowed and water-stained. Clara moved closer, and Hale spread the documents on the floor. There were ledgers, contracts, notes in cramped handwriting, names she recognized, Brill, Voss, even the sheriff. "This is it," Hale said quietly. "This is proof." Clara felt a surge of hope, sharp and fragile. "What do we do with it?" "We take it to someone who can't be bought." "Who?" Hale folded the papers carefully and tucked them inside his coat. "I know a federal marshal. Owes me a favor. If we can get this to him." The door to the saloon slammed open. Clara's head snapped up, and she heard voices, rough, angry, boots on the wooden floor. "Back door," Hale whispered, grabbing her arm. They slipped out through the rear exit, moving fast and low. Behind them, Claire heard Sullivan's voice, raised and irritated, and then the crash of furniture. They reached the horses and mounted quickly. Hale spurred his horse forward, and Clara followed, her pulse hammering in her ears. They didn't stop until they were miles outside town, the ranch finally visible in the distance. Hale pulled his horse to a halt and looked back, scanning the horizon. "We got it," Clara said, breathless. "We actually got it." Hale nodded, his expression grim. "Now we just have to stay alive long enough to use it." They made it back to the ranch just as the sun climbed past noon, the horses lathered and breathing hard. Clara slid off her mount, her legs shaking from the ride, and followed Hale into the house. Crane was sitting up at the table, his face pale but alert. He looked at them with something close to hope. "You got them?" Hale pulled the folded documents from inside his coat and spread them across the table. "Every damn one." Crane reached out with his good hand, his fingers trembling as he touched the papers. "I didn't think they'd still be there." "Well, they were," Clara said, pouring herself a cup of water. Her hands were still shaking. "Now what?" Hale sat down heavily, his jaw tight. "Now we get them to Marshal Hendricks. He's in Silver Ridge, about 2 days' ride north. If anyone can take this to the territorial governor, it's him." 2 days, Crane said quietly. "Voss's men will be looking for us by now. Sullivan probably told them everything the second we left." "Probably," Hale agreed. Clara looked between them, her chest tight. "So we ride fast, leave tonight, get there before they catch up." Hale shook his head. "You're not going." "The hell I'm not. It's too dangerous." "And staying here isn't?" Clara's voice rose. "If Voss's men come looking for those papers, what do you think happens to me? To Crane? They won't know you have anything to do with this. They'll know I live here, that's enough." Clara crossed her arms, her jaw set. "I'm going." Hale stared at her, frustration and something else flickering in his eyes. Then he let out a slow breath and looked away. "You're stubborn as hell." "Learned from the best." Crane let out a weak laugh. "She's got you there, Hale." Hale shot him a look, but there was no real heat in it. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the empty yard. "We leave at sundown. Pack light. Bring what you need to survive, nothing else." Clara nodded and went to her room, her heart pounding. She changed into her riding clothes, packed a small bag with a change of shirt, her hairpin wrapped in cloth, and the knife Hale had given her. When she came back out, Hale was checking the rifles, his movements methodical. "You know how to shoot?" he asked without looking up. "No?" "Then stay close and do what I tell you." Clara wanted to argue, but she just nodded. There'd be time to learn later, if there was a later. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Hale loaded supplies onto the horses, food, water, ammunition. Clara helped Crane into the back room and made sure he had everything he needed. "You're really doing this," Crane said, watching her move around the room. "Looks like it." "You don't have to. You could stay here. Keep your head down." Clara paused, her hand on the doorframe. "And let Voss win." "Better than getting killed." "Maybe," Clara said, "but I didn't come this far to hide." Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket with his good hand and pulled out a small, tarnished brass key. "Take this." Clara frowned. "What is it?" "What?" "Key to a lockbox. It's in the Red Hollow Bank under the name Samuel Crane. My brother." His voice caught slightly. "He died 2 years ago. Left me everything he had, which wasn't much. But there's some money in there, enough to get you out of here if things go bad." "Crane, just take it," he said roughly. "Please." Clara took the key, her throat tight. She slipped it into her pocket and nodded. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Just come back alive." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Clara stood in the garden one last time. The plants were thriving now, the beans climbing high, the squash spreading wide. She'd brought this land back to life, turned dust and death into something green and growing, and now she was leaving it behind. She knelt down and touched the soil, still warm from the sun, and felt a sharp ache in her chest. This place had saved her, given her a reason to fight, a reason to believe she could be more than what the world told her she was. "Ready?" Clara looked up and saw Hale standing a few feet away, the reins of 2 horses in his hands. "Yeah," she said, standing. "I'm ready." They rode north through the gathering dark, the sky turning deep purple and then black. The moon was thin, barely more than a sliver, and the stars spread out overhead like scattered salt. Clara kept her horse close to Hale's, her eyes straining to see the path ahead. They didn't talk. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the night wind moving through the scrub. Hours passed. Clara's back ached, her legs cramped, but she didn't complain. Hale had set a hard pace, and she knew why. Every mile they put between themselves and Red Hollow was a mile closer to safety. Around midnight, Hale pulled his horse to a stop near a cluster of rocks. "We'll rest here for a few hours. Let the horses recover." Clara slid off her mount, her legs nearly buckling. She sat down on a flat rock and rubbed her thighs, trying to get the blood flowing again. Hale tied the horses and walked over, handing her a canteen. "Drink." She drank, the water cool and sharp, and handed it back. "How much farther?" "If we keep this pace, we'll reach Silver Ridge by tomorrow night." "And if Voss's men catch up?" Hale's jaw tightened. "Then we fight." Clara looked at him in the dim starlight, at the hard lines of his face, and felt a strange mix of fear and something else. Trust, maybe. Or just the knowledge that if anyone could get them through this, it was him. "You ever killed anyone?" she asked. Hale was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah." "How many?" "Enough." Clara wanted to ask more, but the look on his face stopped her. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself and stared up at the stars. "You scared?" Hale asked. "Terrified." "Good. Means you're smart." Clara let out a shaky laugh. "Doesn't feel smart. Feels like I'm about to get us both killed." "You didn't get us into this. Voss did, and men like him don't stop unless someone makes them." "What if we can't?" Hale looked at her, his expression serious. "Then at least we tried." They rested for a few hours, taking turns keeping watch. When the sky began to lighten in the east, they mounted up again and rode hard. The landscape changed as they moved north, less scrub, more grass, the land rolling in gentle hills. Clara saw cattle in the distance, a few scattered homesteads, smoke rising from chimneys. By midday, they stopped at a creek to water the horses. Clara knelt by the bank and splashed water on her face, the cold shock clearing her head. "You're doing good," Hale said, crouching beside her. Clara glanced at him. "I feel like I'm falling apart." "You're still here. That's what matters." She wanted to believe him, but her body ached, her mind was foggy from lack of sleep, and every sound made her jump. They were just mounting up again when Clara heard it. Hoofbeats, coming fast from the south. Hale's head snapped around, his hand going to the rifle. "Ride! Now!" Clara didn't argue. She kicked her horse into a gallop, Hale right behind her. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, and Clara risked a glance back. 3 riders, maybe 4. Too far to see their faces, but close enough to be a threat. "Faster!" Hale shouted. Clara leaned low over her horse's neck, urging it forward. The wind tore at her hair, her heart hammering in her chest. Ahead, the land opened up into a wide valley, and Clara saw a line of trees in the distance. "Head for the trees!" Hale called. They pushed the horses harder, the ground blurring beneath them. The riders were gaining, close enough now that Clara could hear them shouting. A gunshot cracked through the air. Clara flinched, but the bullet went wide, kicking up dirt to her left. Hale pulled his rifle and fired back without slowing, the shot echoing across the valley. One of the riders fell back, clutching his shoulder. "Keep going!" Hale yelled. They reached the tree line and plunged into the shadows, branches whipping at Clara's face. Hale veered left, and she followed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the riders crashed into the trees, still shouting. Hale pulled his horse to a sudden stop and dismounted, grabbing his rifle. "Get down! Stay low!" Clara slid off her horse and crouched behind a fallen log, her hands shaking. Hale positioned himself behind a tree, the rifle raised, his eyes scanning the woods. The riders came closer, moving cautiously now. Clara could see them through the trees. 3 men, all armed, their faces hard and mean. One of them called out, "Hale, we know you're in there." Hale didn't answer. "Voss just wants the papers. Hand them over and we'll let you ride on." "Like hell you will," Hale muttered. The man laughed. "Have it your way." A shot rang out, splintering the tree above Hale's head. He returned fire, and one of the men went down with a shout. The other 2 scattered, taking cover behind the trees. For a moment, the woods went silent, except for the sound of Clara's breathing. Then movement. To the left. Clara saw one of the men creeping closer, his gun raised. "Hale!" she whispered urgently. He turned and fired. The man dove behind a tree, cursing. The third man was circling around, trying to flank them. Clara gripped the knife in her pocket, her knuckles white. Hale fired again, and the man yelped, stumbling. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. The other man hesitated, then followed, and within moments the woods were silent again. Hale lowered the rifle, his jaw tight. "They'll be back." With more men. Clara stood on shaking legs. "Then we need to move." They mounted up and rode hard, putting as much distance between themselves and the ambush as they could. By the time the sun set, they were exhausted, but Silver Ridge was finally in sight, a small town nestled in the hills, lights glowing in the windows. They rode straight to the marshal's office, a squat building near the center of town. Hale dismounted and pounded on the door. A man opened it, tall, graying, with a badge pinned to his vest. His eyes widened when he saw Hale. "Jonas Hale. Didn't expect to see you again." "Need your help, Hendricks." The marshal looked past him at Clara, then back at Hale. "Come in." Inside, the office was sparse. A desk, a few chairs, a gun rack on the wall. Hale pulled the documents from his coat and spread them on the desk. "Garrett Voss," Hale said. "Land fraud, forgery, bribery. It's all in here." Hendricks picked up one of the papers, his expression darkening as he read. "Where'd you get this?" "From someone who worked for him. Someone he tried to kill." Hendricks set down the paper and looked at Hale. "You know what this means. If I take this to the governor, Voss will come after you. He's got resources, connections. He won't stop." "I know." "And you're willing to risk that?" Hale glanced at Clara, then back at Hendricks. "Yeah, I am." Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, I'll take it. But you two need to lay low for a while. Voss is going to be looking for blood." "We'll manage," Hale said. They left the marshal's office and found a small boarding house on the edge of town. The room was cramped with a single bed and a chair, but Clara didn't care. She sank onto the bed, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Hale stood by the window, staring out at the dark street. "We did it," Clara said quietly. "Maybe." "What do you mean, maybe? We got the papers to Hendricks. He's taking them to the governor. And Voss still has half the territory in his pocket." Hale turned, his expression grim. "This isn't over, Clara. Not by a long shot." Clara wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. They'd won a battle, but the war was still raging. She lay back on the bed and closed her eyes, too tired to think anymore. When she woke, it was late morning and Hale was gone. Clara sat up, panic flaring in her chest, and then she saw the note on the chair. "Gone to check on Hendricks. Stay here. Back soon." Clara crumpled the note and stood, her body aching. She washed her face in the basin and changed into her spare shirt, then sat by the window and waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the street below filled with people going about their business. Clara watched them, feeling strangely disconnected, like she was looking at a life she didn't belong to anymore. Finally, she heard footsteps on the stairs. The door opened and Hale walked in, his face tense. "What happened?" Clara asked. "Hendricks sent word to the governor. They're opening an investigation." Clara felt a flicker of hope. "That's good, right? It's a start." Hale sat down heavily. "But Voss knows. Hendricks got a telegram this morning. Voss is calling in favors, trying to shut it down before it goes anywhere." "Can he do that?" "He can try." Clara's hands curled into fists. "So what do we do?" "We wait, and we hope Hendricks can hold the line long enough for the investigation to stick." "And if he can't?" Hale looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, Clara saw something close to uncertainty in his eyes. "Then we figure out another way." They stayed in Silver Ridge for 3 days. Hale checked in with Hendricks every morning, and every morning the news was the same. The investigation was moving forward, but slowly. Voss was fighting back, hard. On the 4th day, Hendricks came to the boarding house himself. His face was drawn, his eyes tired. "It's done," he said. Clara's heart leapt. "They arrested him?" "Not yet, but the governor's issued a warrant. Voss is going to trial." Hale let out a slow breath. "How long?" "Few weeks, maybe a month. Depends on how many delays his lawyers can file. Hendricks looked at them both. You two should stay out of Red Hollow until it's over. Voss still has men, and they're not going to just sit around waiting for the law to catch up. We'll stay, Hale said. Hendricks nodded and left. Clara sat down, her hands shaking, and let the reality of it wash over her. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. But Hale was right. It wasn't over. That night, they sat in the small room, eating a meal of bread and cheese Hale had bought from the general store. The silence between them was heavy, weighted with everything they'd been through. What happens after? Clara asked finally. After what? After the trial. After Voss is arrested. What happens to the ranch? Hale set down his bread, his expression distant. I don't know. If the deed holds up, it's mine. If not, he shrugged. I'll start over somewhere else. Just like that? I've done it before. Clara looked at him, at the weariness in his face, and felt something tighten in her chest. You don't have to do it alone this time. Hale met her gaze, and for a moment something unspoken passed between them. Then he looked away. You don't owe me anything, Clara. I know. Then why it's... Because I want to. The words came out more forcefully than she intended. I want to stay. At the ranch. With you. If you'll have me. Hale stared at her, surprise flickering across his face. You mean that? I wouldn't say it if I didn't. He was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. All right. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. All right, she echoed. 2 weeks later, they got word that Voss had been arrested. The trial was set for the following month, and Hendricks said the evidence was strong. Strong enough that even Voss's lawyers couldn't bury it. Hale and Clara packed up and rode back to Red Hollow. The town looked the same as it had when they left, but something felt different. People stared as they rode through, but no one approached. No one said a word. When they reached the ranch, Clara's breath caught. The garden was still there, overgrown, wild, but alive. The beans had climbed so high they'd tangled with each other, and the squash had spread across half the plot. But it was growing, thriving. Clara dismounted and walked over, her hands brushing the leaves, and felt tears prick her eyes. It survived, she said quietly. Hale stood beside her, his expression soft. Yeah, it did. Inside the house, Crane was sitting at the table, his arm in a sling but his color better. He looked up when they walked in, and a slow smile spread across his face. You made it. So did you, Clara said. Crane shrugged. Barely, but yeah. They sat together, the three of them, and Hale told Crane everything. About the trial, the arrest, the investigation. Crane listened, his face unreadable, and when Hale finished, he let out a long breath. I never thought I'd see him fall, Crane said quietly. He hasn't fallen yet, Hale said, but he will. Crane nodded. Then he looked at Clara. Thank you for not letting me die. Clara met his gaze. Don't waste it. I won't. The trial took place a month later. Clara and Hale rode to the territorial capital to watch, along with dozens of other homesteaders who'd been targeted by Voss's schemes. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Voss sat at the defense table, his face calm, his lawyers surrounding him like a wall. But when the prosecutor stood and began laying out the evidence, the documents Crane had saved, the testimonies of men who'd been forced off their land, Voss's expression began to crack. The trial lasted 3 days. On the third day, the jury came back. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. People cheered, cried, embraced each other. Clara sat beside Hale, her hands gripping the edge of the bench, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Victory. Voss was sentenced to 10 years in prison. His assets were seized, his empire dismantled, and the homesteaders, every single one who'd been forced off their land, were given the chance to reclaim it, including Hale. They rode back to the ranch that evening, the setting sun painting the sky gold and red. Clara looked out at the land, at the garden she'd brought back to life, and felt a fierce, unshakable certainty settle in her bones. This place was hers now, not because someone had given it to her, but because she'd fought for it, and she wasn't letting go. That night, Clara stood in the garden and let herself cry, not from sadness, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of everything she'd carried and finally set down. The tears came hot and fast, and she didn't try to stop them. She just stood there under the stars, her hands pressed to her face, and let it all out. When she finally stopped, her chest felt lighter, clearer. She wiped her eyes and looked around at the rows of plants she'd coaxed from the dead earth. In the moonlight, they looked almost silver, their leaves rustling in the night breeze. This garden had taught her something she hadn't known she needed to learn, that survival wasn't the same as defeat, and that building something from nothing wasn't weakness. It was the hardest kind of strength. "You all right?" Clara turned and saw Hale standing at the edge of the garden, his hands in his pockets. She hadn't heard him approach. "Yeah," she said, her voice rough. "I'm all right." He walked over and stood beside her, looking out at the plants. "You did something here that most people couldn't." "I just planted some seeds." "No." Hale shook his head. "You fought for something that mattered, and you didn't give up, even when you should have." Clara looked at him, at the tired lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like he was always bracing for the next hit. "Neither did you." "I had something to fight for this time." The words hung between them, and Clara felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that she understood, that she felt the same way. But the words wouldn't come. So she just stood there, shoulder to shoulder with him, and let the silence say what she couldn't. The next morning, Crane was sitting on the porch when Clara came out with coffee. His arm was still in a sling, but he was moving better, his color almost back to normal. He took the cup she offered and nodded his thanks. "You leaving?" Clara asked, sitting down beside him. Crane took a sip and stared out at the horizon. "Should. Probably overstayed my welcome already." "That's not what I asked." He glanced at her, something wry in his expression. "You want me to stay?" Clara thought about it. A few weeks ago, the answer would have been an immediate no. But things had changed. Crane had changed. Or maybe she had. "I think," she said carefully, "that you could stay if you wanted to. Hale could use the help around here, and you owe him that much." Crane let out a short laugh. "Owe him? That's one way to put it. What would you call it?" "A second chance I don't deserve." Clara looked at him, at the shame still etched in the lines of his face, and felt something soften in her chest. "Maybe you don't, but you're getting it anyway. What you do with it, that's on you." Crane was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. "All right, I'll stay. For a while, anyway." "Good." He looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You mean that?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." A week passed. Then another. The ranch settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Hale worked the land, fixing fences and tending the cattle. Crane helped where he could, his strength slowly returning. And Clara threw herself into the garden, expanding the rows, planting new seeds, coaxing more life from the stubborn soil. One afternoon, Ruth Calloway rode up in her wagon, a basket of fresh bread balanced on the seat beside her. She climbed down with her usual stiff determination and walked over to where Clara was weeding. "Heard about the trial," Ruth said, setting the basket down. "Figured you could use something that didn't come out of a can." Clara stood and wiped her hands on her apron. "Thank you." Ruth looked around at the garden, her expression approving. "You've done well here. Better than most would have." "I had help." "Maybe, but help only gets you so far. The rest is all you." Clara felt a flush of pride but didn't know what to say. Ruth didn't seem to need a response. She just nodded and started back toward her wagon. "Ruth," Clara called. The older woman turned. "Why did you help us? Back when all this started?" Ruth tilted her head, considering. "Because I've lived long enough to know when someone's worth fighting for, and you are. Both of you." She climbed onto the wagon seat. "Don't waste it." Clara watched her drive away, the words settling over her like a promise. The following week, a letter arrived from Marshall Hendricks. Hale read it at the kitchen table, his expression unreadable, then passed it to Clara. The deed to the ranch had been officially validated. All claims against it dismissed. The land was his, legally and permanently. Clara set the letter down, her chest tight. "It's over." "Yeah," Hale said quietly. "It is." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of victory settling over them. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet, earned. "What now?" Clara asked. Hale looked at her. Now we build. Building turned out to be harder than fighting. The barn needed a new roof, and the fences were falling apart in half a dozen places. The well was running low, and Hale wanted to dig a second one near the spring. There were cattle to tend, winter supplies to gather, and 100 small things that demanded attention every single day. But Clara didn't mind. The work was hard, but it was hers. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was building something that would last. One evening, she and Hale were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sunset. Crane had gone into town to pick up supplies, and the ranch was quiet, except for the distant lowing of cattle. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if Fairley hadn't left?" Hale asked. Clara considered the question. "Sometimes, but I don't think it would have been better." No. She looked out at the garden, at the land stretching endlessly around them. Fairley wanted someone to take care of him, someone who'd cook his meals and wash his clothes and never ask for anything in return. I would have been miserable. "And this? You're not miserable here?" Clara turned to him, her expression serious. "Here, I'm myself. I'm not pretending to be someone I'm not just to survive, and that's worth more than anything Fairley could have given me." Hale was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "Yeah, I get that." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to black. And Clara realized, with a quiet certainty, that this was what home felt like. Not a place, not a roof over her head, but the feeling of being seen for who she was and not having to apologize for it. A month later, Crane announced he was leaving. Clara wasn't surprised. She'd seen the restlessness building in him, the way he stared at the horizon like he was searching for something just out of reach. They were in the barn, and Crane was packing his few belongings into a saddlebag. Hale stood nearby, his arms crossed, his expression neutral. "Where will you go?" Clara asked. Crane shrugged. "West, maybe, or north, somewhere I can start over." "You could start over here." "No," Crane said quietly. "I can't. Every time I look at you, I remember what I said, what I did, and I know I don't deserve to be here." Clara walked over and stood in front of him, her arms crossed. "You're right, you don't deserve it, but that's not the point." Crane looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "The point," Clara continued, "is that you can choose to be better. You can choose to prove that what you did doesn't define you, but you can't do that if you keep running." "I'm not running." "Yes, you are." Crane's jaw tightened, and for a moment Clara thought he was going to argue, but then he looked away, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know how to be better," he said quietly. "Then figure it out," Clara said, "but do it somewhere you're not alone, because if you leave now, you'll just find another hole to crawl into, and you'll never climb out." Crane stared at her, something raw and uncertain in his eyes. Then he looked at Hale. "She always this stubborn?" he asked. Hale's mouth twitched. "Pretty much." Crane let out a slow breath and set down the saddlebag. "All right, I'll stay. But if I screw up again—" "You will," Clara said. "Everyone does. The question is what you do after." Crane nodded slowly. And for the first time since Clara had met him, she saw something other than shame in his face. She saw hope. Winter came hard that year. The snow fell thick and heavy, burying the garden and turning the ranch into a world of white silence. Clara spent her days inside, mending clothes, cooking meals, and planning for spring. Hale and Crane worked together to keep the cattle fed and the buildings intact, their breaths clouding in the freezing air. One night, a blizzard hit. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the door. Clara sat by the fire, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and watched the flames dance. Hale came in from the barn, shaking snow from his coat. "Cattle are secure. Crane's checking the fences. He shouldn't be out in this." Tried to tell him that. He didn't listen. Clara stood and walked to the window, peering out into the white chaos. She couldn't see more than a few feet, the world swallowed by the storm. "He'll be fine," Hale said, coming to stand beside her. "He's tougher than he looks." "I know, but I still worry." Hale glanced at her. "You care about him." Clara hesitated. "I care about what happens to him. That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" She didn't answer. Outside, the storm raged on. An hour later, Crane stumbled through the door, half frozen and covered in snow. Clara and Hale pulled him inside, stripping off his wet coat and wrapping him in blankets. His teeth chattered so hard he couldn't speak. Clara made hot coffee and forced him to drink, her hands steady even though her heart was pounding. Slowly, the color came back to his face and the shaking stopped. "You're an idiot," Clara said. Crane let out a weak laugh. "Yeah, I know. You could have died out there." "But I didn't." He looked at her, his eyes serious. "Thanks to you." Clara shook her head. "Don't make this a thing." Too late. When spring finally came, the snow melted and the land woke up. Clara walked through the garden, surveying the damage. Some of the plants hadn't survived the winter, but most had. The beans were already sending up new shoots, and the squash vines were spreading across the thawed ground. She knelt down and pressed her hands into the soil, feeling its coolness, its promise. This was the third planting she'd done here, and each time felt like a small miracle. Hale walked over and crouched beside her. "Looks good." "It will be." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I've been thinking." Clara looked at him. "About what?" "About expanding. There's good land to the east near the spring. If we cleared it, we could plant more, maybe even sell some of the harvest in town." Clara's heart quickened. "You mean it?" "Yeah, but I can't do it alone." She met his eyes and saw the question there, unspoken but clear. "You're not alone," she said quietly. Hale's expression softened. "No, I guess I'm not." Over the next few months, they worked harder than Clara had ever worked in her life. They cleared the land, turned the soil, planted rows and rows of vegetables and herbs. Crane helped when he could, his strength fully returned, and together the three of them built something that felt bigger than any of them alone. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day, Crane cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said. Clara and Hale both looked at him. "I want to go back to town, talk to some of the people Voss hurt, see if there's anything I can do to make it right." Clara frowned. "Like what?" "I don't know yet, but I owe them, and I need to face that." Hale nodded slowly. "That's a good thing to do." "Yeah, maybe." Crane looked at Clara. "You taught me that running doesn't fix anything, so I'm going to stop." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. "Good." Crane left the next morning, riding into town with a resolve Clara hadn't seen in him before. When he came back a week later, he looked exhausted, but lighter somehow. "How'd it go?" Clara asked. Crane sat down heavily. "Hard. Some people wouldn't even talk to me, but a few did, and I told them I was sorry, that I'd help however I could. And? And some of them believed me. Some didn't, but at least I tried." Clara nodded. "That's all you can do." Crane looked at her, gratitude clear in his eyes. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "I didn't do it for you," Clara said. "I did it for me. Because I needed to believe people could change." "Do you? Believe it?" Clara thought about the woman she'd been when she stepped off that stagecoach, broken, afraid, with nothing but a carpet bag and a handful of useless promises. And she thought about who she was now. "Yeah," she said. "I do." Summer arrived in full force, the sun beating down on the ranch and turning the garden into a riot of green. The harvest was better than Clara had dared hope. Baskets of beans, squash, tomatoes, herbs, more than they could eat or store. Hale loaded a wagon and took it into town to sell. When he came back, he had a pouch of coins and a satisfied look on his face. "Sold everything," he said, setting the pouch on the table. "People are already asking when we'll have more." Clara stared at the coins, her chest tight. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was success. "We did it," she said quietly. "You did it," Hale corrected. "This garden was your idea, your work." "Our work," Clara said firmly. "All of us." Crane, who was leaning against the doorframe, grinned. "Look at us, a bunch of broken-down fools making something out of nothing." Clara laughed, and it felt good. "Yeah, that's exactly what we are." One evening in late summer, Clara was sitting in the garden, her hands in the soil, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw a man she didn't recognize, tall, thin, with a nervous energy about him. "Can I help you?" Clara asked, standing. The man took off his hat and twisted it in his hands. "Are you Clara Whitlock?" "I am." "My name's Samuel Reed. I heard about what you did, about Voss, and I wanted to thank you." Clara frowned. I don't think we've met. No, ma'am, but Voss took my land 3 years ago. Said my deed wasn't valid. I lost everything. Reed's voice shook slightly. When he got arrested, when they started giving land back, I got mine returned, and I have you to thank for that. Clara felt her throat tighten. I didn't do it alone. Maybe not, but you did it, and that matters. Reed put his hat back on. If you ever need anything, you let me know. I owe you. He turned and walked away before Clara could respond. She stood there, her hands still dirty from the soil, and felt the weight of what he'd said settle over her. She'd set out to save herself, but in doing so, she'd helped save others too. That night, Clara sat with Hale on the porch, watching the stars come out. Reed came by today, she said. I saw. What'd he want? To thank me for what we did. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know what the hardest part of all this was? What? Believing it was worth it, that fighting back would actually change anything. He looked at her. But it did, because of you. Clara shook her head. Because of us. Hale reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he'd done that, and Clara felt her breath catch. His hand was rough and warm, and it fit perfectly around hers. Yeah, he said quietly. Because of us. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Fall came, and with it, the second harvest. The garden yielded even more than the first, and Clara found herself spending hours planning for the next year. More rows, different crops, maybe even a small greenhouse to extend the growing season. One afternoon, she was sketching out ideas in a notebook when Crane walked over and looked over her shoulder. You're really building something here, Satam, he said. Clara glanced up. We all are. No, Crane said. This is yours. Hale's got the ranch, but this garden, this is all you. Clara set down her pencil. It doesn't feel like just mine. Maybe not, but it started with you, and that's what matters. Clara thought about that, about the day she'd first looked at the dead, cracked soil and decided to fight for it, about the hours she'd spent hauling water, pulling weeds, coaxing life from nothing, about the moment she'd realized this place could be hers if she was willing to work for it. Yeah, she said softly. I guess it did. Winter came again, but this time it felt different. The ranch was prepared, stored food, repaired buildings, plenty of firewood. And this time Clara wasn't afraid. She knew they could survive. More than that, she knew they could thrive. One snowy evening, the three of them sat around the fire, playing cards and drinking whiskey. Crane was laughing at something Hale had said, and Clara felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. This was family. Not the kind she'd been born into, but the kind she'd chosen. The kind that had been forged through hardship and choice and the simple act of not giving up. I've been thinking, Hale said, setting down his cards. Dangerous, Crane muttered. Hale ignored him and looked at Clara. About making this official. Clara's heart skipped. Making what official? Us. This place. You and me. Clara's breath caught. What are you saying? Hale looked uncomfortable, like the words were hard to find. I'm saying I want you to stay, not as hired help, not as someone passing through, but as my partner. In everything. Clara stared at him, her chest tight. You mean, I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. The room went silent. Crane was staring at his cards, suddenly very interested in them. Clara's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts tumbling over each other. She thought about Thomas Fairley, about the life he'd promised that had turned out to be a lie. She thought about the woman she'd been when she stepped off that stagecoach, desperate, alone, willing to accept scraps. She wasn't that woman anymore. Yes, she said quietly. I'll have you. Hale's face broke into a rare, genuine smile. And Clara felt something inside her settle, like a door closing on the past and opening on the future. Crane raised his glass. Well, hell, guess we're family now. Clara laughed, and the sound was bright and real. Spring came again, as it always did. The snow melted, the land thawed, and the garden woke up. Clara planted the rose with Hale beside her, their hands working in tandem, their movements synchronized from months of working together. Crane had started courting a woman in town, a widow named Sarah who ran the general store. He was nervous about it, stumbling over his words whenever he talked about her, but Clara could see the hope in his eyes. "You think she'll say yes?" he asked one afternoon. "To what?" "If I ask her to dinner." Clara smiled. "I think she'd be a fool not to." Crane looked relieved. "Thanks. Just don't screw it up." "I'll try." A few weeks later, Clara and Hale rode into town for supplies. As they walked down the main street, people nodded to them. Some even smiled. Clara realized with a start that she wasn't a stranger here anymore. She was part of this place, woven into its fabric. They stopped at the general store, and Sarah greeted them warmly. "Crane's been talking about you two non-stop," she said with a grin. Clara laughed. "Good things, I hope." "Mostly." Sarah leaned in conspiratorially. "He's a good man. Rough around the edges, but good." "Yeah," Clara agreed. "He is." On the way back to the ranch, Hale reached over and took Clara's hand. They rode like that, side by side, the sun warm on their faces. "You happy?" Hale asked. Clara thought about it, about everything she'd been through, everything she'd fought for, everything she'd built. "Yeah," she said. "I am." That summer they got married. It was a small ceremony, just a handful of people gathered at the ranch. Ruth Calloway stood as witness, and Crane gave Clara away, his face unusually serious. When the officiant asked if she took Jonas Hale to be her husband, Clara didn't hesitate. "I do." And when Hale slipped a simple silver band onto her finger, Clara felt a completeness she'd never known before. The years that followed weren't easy. There were droughts and storms, crop failures and lean winters. But Clara and Hale faced them together, and that made all the difference. Crane eventually married Sarah, and they built a house on the edge of town. He came by the ranch often, helping with the work, and Clara watched him transform into someone she barely recognized, steady, reliable, kind. The man who'd mocked her in the street was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned what it meant to be better. One afternoon, 5 years after Clara had first arrived in Red Hollow, she stood in the garden and looked around. The rows stretched wide and green, filled with beans and squash and tomatoes and herbs. Beyond them, new rows had been added, and beyond those, a small greenhouse Hale had built. This wasn't just a garden anymore. It was a farm. And it was hers. Hale walked over and stood beside her, his arm around her waist. "Thinking about something? Just how far we've come." "Yeah, we have." Clara leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "You ever regret it? Taking me in?" "Not once." "Even when I'm stubborn?" "Especially then." Clara smiled and looked out at the land they'd built together. The land that had once been dead and was now alive. The land that had saved her as much as she'd saved it. She thought about the woman she'd been, the one who'd stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but fear and a broken promise. And she thought about who she'd become. Here's what Clara had learned, standing in that garden with dirt under her nails and the sun on her face. People will try to tell you who you are. They'll try to define you by your mistakes, your circumstances, your failures. And if you let them, they'll break you down until there's nothing left. But you don't have to let them. You can choose to fight. You can choose to build. You can choose to turn dead ground into something living and green. And when the world tells you you're worthless, you can choose to prove it wrong. Not because you're perfect, not because you never stumble or fall or doubt yourself, but because you refuse to give up, because you plant seeds even when the soil looks hopeless, because you show mercy even when vengeance would be easier, because you keep going one day at a time, one choice at a time, until you've built something that no one can take away. That's what survival really means. Not just staying alive, but staying yourself. Not just enduring, but growing. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. Clara Whitlock had arrived in Red Hollow with nothing. And now she stood on land that was legally, truly hers, beside a man who saw her for exactly who she was, surrounded by a garden she'd brought back from the dead. She'd survived. She'd fought. She'd won. Not because someone had saved her, but because she'd saved herself. And that made all the difference.